It's my pleasure to introduce you today to the first Bullard lecture for the GP section. We changed the name from the Cox lecture to the Bullard lecture because Bullard was a Bowie medalist, so we now have a Bowie lecture. It's not listed as a Bowie lecture, but it is a Bowie lecture. Our speaker today is Vincent Courtillot, who is he's everything. He's a professor of geophysics at the University of Paris and the director of the Institut de Physique du Globe. He's a graduate of the Paris School of Mines, Stanford University, and the University of Paris. He's past president of the European Union of Geosciences, a fellow of the AGU, member of the Academia Europaea, and associate of the Royal Astronomical Society, and a number of other things, including the, what is it that's equivalent to a knighthood? Sub-knighthood. Something really important. He disappears occasionally from research to work in the Ministry of National Education and Research and Technology in France to do some valuable service in the government, and we're pleased that he's returned now to science because we need his abundant energy and efforts on our behalf. His work has focused on a number of things throughout paleomagnetism and geomagnetism, including variations of the Earth's magnetic field, plate tectonics, magnetic reversals, flood basalts, and the connections, which are interesting, to the possible connections to mass extinctions, continental drift, and so on. He's published over 150 papers in professional journals and a book, which in French is La vie en catastrophe, and has just been translated and has appeared or will appear in English soon from Cambridge University Press. He's going to... No, I didn't read it. It's on my... You didn't give it to me yet. The title of his talk today is Plumes and Earth's Dynamic History from Core to Biosphere. And I would like to present, on behalf of the AGU, a certificate that recognizes you for the first 2002 Sir Edward Crisp Bullard Lecturer.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa, for the introduction. I'll try and get you a copy of my book. I'm really very thankful to AGU and to my section for having asked me to give this lecture. I'm grateful to you, Lisa, and to your predecessor, Bill Lowry, for having suggested that I stand here. And although I fail to understand completely the political issues of changing from Alan to Ted, to name this GP section Bowie lecture, I thought I could take the liberty of putting the two names together because I think both Ted Bullard and Alan Cox are truly giants in our field. They really have set examples for what a lot of us are trying to do. And you know, I only had little interaction with Ted Bullard. I had little, and I will tell you a little bit about that. I had far more extensive interaction with Alan Cox. I was his student 30 years ago, and it's certainly with quite a bit of emotion that I think back of him. It's quite clear that he was one of the very few people that made me discover the beauties of modern earth sciences and certainly set me on the course which I was trying to follow for the following decades. Lisa has given you the title which I originally selected for this lecture, and I felt it might be a good idea to add a subtitle, which you can read here, A Growing Understanding of the Importance and Use of Catastrophes in Earth's History. Catastrophes being here in the meaning that has become familiar in the last decades thanks to advances in physics. And I hope I'll show you examples that are selected mostly from our fields of geomag and paleomag that testify to this. Going back a few hundred years, you all know and teach your students that geosciences developed in the 19th century mainly because Buffon defeated Cuvier, or if you want, uniformitarianism won over catastrophism, and I've listed other very famous names associated with both schools of thought. The 19th century was a real fight between these two views. I tend to believe that if uniformitarianism had not defeated catastrophism, geology would not have developed as a quantitative modern science, yet this does not mean that they were always right. In the last decades of the last century, we have seen a revival in many areas of the sciences of catastrophism in various ways. Tom's work in mathematics introduced the idea of catastrophe theory and geometry. Tom recently passed away. Fractals were introduced by Benoît Mandelbrot, and nonlinear physics and deterministic chaos theory were developed. We now realize how important Poincaré's contribution over 100 years ago was, and we've heard the names of Lorentz, Hopf, Ruel, and others, and several sessions of AGU have been devoted to the topic, and this was the major subject also of Don Turcotte's lecture. This has given instabilities in general a new and rather prominent role. And one question you could ask is this development and realization of the importance of catastrophes and instabilities contradictory with our views of uniformitarianism? And the answer is clearly no. And actually, you can go back to 1830, a quite remarkable and very modern statement by William Whewell, who said, "Why must we insist upon it that man has been long enough an observer to obtain the average of forces which are changing through immeasurable time?" I think that had this sentence been noted and fully understood in 1830, a number of things could have advanced faster. But clearly, Whewell was in a minority, and it took a long time for people to realize how right he was. Sometimes the vision he introduced is called substantive uniformitarianism, and I've translated it into a simple sentence, which is, has mankind been around enough to sample the whole natural spectrum? And clearly we know the answer is no. I'm going to select a number of examples, drawing them from various areas of geophysics and concentrating on several envelopes of the Earth, and going from the shorter to the longer time scales, beginning to the one subject that actually I got started with in geomagnetism over 2 decades ago, and that is geomagnetic jerks. And actually that is the area for which I had a slight association with Teddy Bullard, who's shown here in full dress somewhere, I think, in South Africa in the field. I'm not sure about the location. That is coming from the Scripps website, which has other more embarrassing pictures of Teddy Bullard, which you might want to look up. I didn't dare show the best one, but it's in my computer, of course. What Teddy Bullard and Stuart Malin did, and I think this was one of the last major contributions from Ted Bullard, was to compile the historical magnetic declination data from the London area since the 16th century, and the series they put together is shown here as the lower curve with the open circles. At about the same time, although we did it slower and it came out much later, we in Paris compiled the equivalent series of data acquired in our capital city since 1541, and the series is shown as the full black circles. I could spend my entire talk just discussing these two curves. I think they're fascinating. They're telling you about comparative history of science and non-science in England and in France over that time period. By looking at the increases and decreases in standard deviation or gaps, you can actually reconstruct the relative histories of Paris and London, and it's a fun thing to do. But the most important thing is to check that for these not very distant sites, the two curves are in remarkable agreement, and we can use one to fill in the gaps or the areas where the data are not as good in the other. And when you do that, you generate the curve which is shown here, beginning, actually the values are really good only after 1670. Going back to the present, you find this trend which you all know, which is that declination has essentially been swinging quite a lot by almost 30 degrees in that period. And if you take the first derivative of that curve, you get the dashed curve here with, of course, a noise level that increases as you go back in time. First derivative is a high pass filter, and actually increases higher frequencies and generates noise. But even that, you see that secular variation seems to be, the first derivative of the field, seems to be a piecewise linear process interrupted at a number of times by rather sharp breaks. And if you take the third derivative of the declination curve, it's a little bit like, even though it will be much more noisy, the red curve that you just saw appearing with essentially delta functions or spikes lasting on the order of 1 year, which are very sharp compared to a slow background of 300 years when everything else changes slowly. So this is the first example of catastrophes or instabilities or sharp events interrupting a longer, you might say, uniformitarian series. Another example, now drawing from paleomagnetism, and of course Alan's name is associated with much of the fundamental work on establishing the reversal timescale, we find that magnetic reversals, if you derive them to first order, would essentially generate a set of spikes, Poissonian distribution of spikes, each spike being the length of a reversal. I would claim something like a few thousand years, even we have seen this afternoon a poster claiming for longer times, which I doubt. Actually, this is on the background of very slow variations on the order of millions of years. And then we can go on. We were in the core with jerks and reversals. We can go up to the mantle, go to geodynamics, and you have all heard and seen over the recent years a remarkable progress in analogical, analytical, numerical modeling of these instabilities. The drawing you just saw was from an animation by the group at the University of Frankfurt, showing these instabilities in fluid flow, which have typical time constants on the order of a million years, over a long-term background on the order of tens to hundreds of millions of years. Going one step up, continuing our voyage from the center of the Earth, we reach the lithosphere and the crust, and another type of instability which actually can be observed at the Earth's surface is flood basalts. You see a map here of the 10 or so large recognized large igneous provinces and flood basalts, and they have a lot of work has been focused on dating, evaluating, analyzing these flood basalts and large igneous provinces, and it's found that they form a sequence of 12 events in the last 400 million years, which typically are spikes in a way. That is the flux of volcanic material in place. Typical duration is 1 million years, and I had a poster yesterday describing the details of a review of the ages of these events. Now we're going one more layer up. We are getting into the fluid envelopes and the biosphere, and another time series we can look at is the evolution of diversity of life on Earth. This is a famous curve that you've all seen in various forms. It's showing the number of families of species found by paleontologists in the last 200 years as a function of time, beginning, for those of you who are too far in the back, from the onset of Phanerozoic or Cambrian time to the left, to the present, to the right. And if you take something like the first derivative of that curve, you get something which is called the extinction rate, and you see that extinctions are a constant process that is inherent to evolution of life. But if you define a noisy background, which is shown by that gray curve, you find that at a number of rather rare instances, there is a clear departure from that background level of extinctions, and something much more intense happens, which is, well, essentially that the first derivative of that evolution curve looks like a bunch of probably 7 rather short delta functions. Our ideas are that the typical duration of these events is on the order of 1/10 to 1 million years, again on a much longer background of millions of years or tens of millions of years. And I could go on with other examples of interest to our AGU community. I have listed here with no illustration other examples from the fluid envelopes, the ocean and atmosphere, data contributed by meteorology and climatology, and you're all aware that on 4 different time scale, deglaciation, fast deglaciation events, or Densgaard-Oeschger events, or Heinrich events, or El Nino Southern Ocean oscillations, or North Atlantic oscillations, all look like rather sharp changes in a time series of events that is flowing much more smoothly. So my impression is that in many cases, geophysical time series look like functions. I'm saying functions because if I were mathematically correct, I would talk about distributions, which have some nth degree derivative that looks essentially like slow varying processes with fast varying processes on top, meaning that the constant of the changes, tau, is much shorter than the typical duration of the slow changes. And if you really want to make a very simple model of that, it would just look like a flat line with a bunch of delta functions. And of course, this means that we have to be able to measure time, I will come back to that, in a way that allows us to resolve these delta functions. I'm essentially going to go into a little bit more detail on two subsets of the example I showed you, and the first one will focus on the mental and mental instabilities. And this is a little complement to a short presentation I made Saturday morning, which was suggested to me as I spent a very nice sabbatical in Caltech last year and beginning of this year, thinking, what about the problem that seems to oppose geophysical giants, not Bullard and Cox, but in that case Jason Morgan and his brilliant original idea that plumes might be instabilities rising from as deep as the core mental boundary, and the opposing view of our friend Don Anderson, who believes that there are no such things as deep plumes and that they can arise simply by decompression of fairly shallow asthenospheric material whenever the state of stress allows that magma to ooze through the crust. And the question I asked myself was very simple. Are these two versions incompatible? And the next question is, could seamounts not all be alike? Could there be different kinds of seamounts, pretty much in the same way that we now know that a mid-ocean ridge volcano or a subduction zone volcano are completely different geophysical beings, even though 100 years ago we might have said, well, these are two volcanoes, these are two hotspots, I'm going to put them in the same bag. So could seamounts be as different one from the other as a mid-ocean ridge volcano is from a subduction zone volcano? In the paper I referred to that I discussed 2 days ago, and I'm not going to go back on this, I tried to set up a list of fairly simple geochemical, geophysical, geomorphological criteria in which I could potentially distinguish longer duration, higher flux, deeper events from shorter duration, shallower events. And the criteria I finally selected are listed here. A geophysical criterion, which is the evaluation of the buoyancy flux. Actually, I wrote buoyancy ratio. It's buoyancy flux coming from these plumes. From geochemistry, I borrowed the helium 3-to-4 ratio, even though my friend Claude Allègre explained to us that we should always look at helium 4-to-3 and not 3-to-4. I had a great introduction to modern progress in tomography and looked at a number of tomographic models of the upper and lower mental, trying to see if I could relate low shear wave velocity anomalies at least to the depth of the transition zone. At the time I did this work, I felt by looking at all tomographic models that there was too much lack of correlation in the lower mental for me to make a robust estimate. I believe at this meeting we are going to see a significant advance, and I'm actually very sorry that at the very time I'm speaking to you, my friend Tony Dallin is addressing another audience with what I believe is a major advance that they've made in Princeton, which will help us resolve lower mental tomography much better. And then, of course, some of my criteria are the original criteria which made Tuzo Wilson and Jason Morgan discover and understand plumes, and that's the presence of seamount chains or tracks, and when observable, when not destroyed by collision or subduction, the presence of a flood basalt or an oceanic plateau, both being combined in the general term large igneous provinces at the onset of the track. And when I applied that very simple set of 5 criteria to the generally accepted list of 50 hotspot candidates, I found that only a very small number I took criteria that could be discussed. I said, if I want a plume to qualify as a potential deep candidate, it has to agree with at least 3 out of my 5 criteria. You can change that, you can test how robust it is, but the idea is that many plumes do not fit enough criteria to be safely assumed to come from a deep origin, but some are. And the 7 that survive this sifting criterion, and that may actually come, I'm saying may come, and I think they do come for reasons I may try to explain from the lower mantle, are distributed in the 2 hemispheres. 3 of them are in the Pacific hemisphere. They are essentially the ones I'm sure you would all have guessed: Hawaii, Easter, and Louisville. Actually, Galapagos could qualify if you accept the idea that it started as the Colombian plateau basalt, which is now in the Atlantic Ocean. And on the Indo-Atlantic hemisphere, 4 hotspots qualify: Iceland, Afar, Tristan da Cunha, and Reunion. Well, there are various things you can do once you've selected that subset, and one of them is, again, to go back to Jason Morgan's original ideas and test the kinematics of this particular subset of hotspots. It's been shown recently that if you don't separate the hotspots, they're actually moving much faster than one would think if you take them by pairs. But if you've actually been mixing different kinds of hotspots, it makes sense. You're applying least squares to something, and you're mixing carrots and apples, and you're going to get noise as a result of your inversion. If you restrain yourself to the 3 large potential primary hotspots of Hawaii, Easter, and Louisville, you find that indeed they have not moved much with respect to each other. You find Morgan's original result, and by not much, I mean something like less than ½ centimeter per year average motion in the last 80 million years since we have joint information on the 3 tracks. If you apply the same analysis, and this was done almost a decade ago by Mueller and co-authors, to the Indo-Atlantic ones, you basically find the same result. So over most of their existence, the primary hotspots in the 2 hemispheres formed a fixed set of points, or slowly deformable set of points. But the next question is, how can we relate one to the other? This is a question you all know well about. It's a problem of the kinematic circuit closure through Antarctica. And thanks to my being close to Johann Stock at Caltech and using the recent work by Carol Raymond and Steve Candy, and in particular the recent assessment of east versus west Antarctica motion, it was possible to predict what the motion of the Hawaiian hotspot should have been if it had been fixed with respect to Reunion. So the idea is you take Reunion as the best example of the Indo-Atlantic subset of hotspots. You use the track burnt on the African and Indian plates going back to the Deccan Traps 65 million years ago, and you transfer that to the Pacific Ocean. And the points you get after the latest kinematic revision are the red ones with the ages and the uncertainties marked. And you can clearly see something that several authors have been claiming now for a while. The discrepancy is not large, though it is significant and slowly growing, going back to the time of the bend. And we heard at this meeting, which pleased me very much, that the bend could be a few million years older than usually assumed. And the previous period clearly sees a very large discrepancy, very large and growing very fast. If you simply plot the great circle distance between predicted and observed position of Hawaii as a function of time, that is the upper curve here, going from present at left to 80 million years ago, which is the age of the oldest Hawaiian Emperor chain volcano, you find that indeed the discrepancy increases at about 1 centimeter per year, going back to 50 million years ago, but was growing much faster in the previous tens of millions of years, with a typical velocity on the order of 5 centimeters per year. Well, we can draw on other areas of geophysics to find different tests of that idea. And if, for instance, and there's been a lot of new results presented by John Tarduno, Bob Duncan, and colleagues on a recent ODP leg at this meeting, if you look at the paleolatitude of the Hawaiian hotspot, a completely independent data set from the one on top, you find that, although the data set at the time I used this was rather scant and has been completed quite a bit at this meeting, you find that the latitude of Hawaii has remained fairly stable in the last 50 million years, and actually was quite different before, with a southward drift on the order of 5 centimeters per year. The red band I've put is just a question mark on when was exactly the time of the change between these 2 uniform modes of motion, and I just showed very simple-minded interpolations in red and black, depending on whether you like 40 or 50 as your age. And with everything we've been hearing at this meeting, I'd be tempted to push it to the 50 million year older time scale. If you do the same thing, and that's a third cartoon going down, for the Reunion hotspot on the other side of the Earth, the data set is even smaller than for Hawaii. Yet, if you've got this preconceived idea that something happened 50 million years ago, you find that the data are compatible with Reunion having also been fixed for the last 50 million years and having drifted northward at a slower velocity on the order of 3 centimeters per year in the previous tens of millions of years. A final and fourth bit of evidence comes from true polar wonder. I don't think I have time in this lecture to go in detail. This was discussed at several occasions during this meeting and previous meetings on determinations of true polar wonder and what it means. It basically tries to evaluate the motion of a frame of reference fixed in the mantle with respect to the rotation axis of the Earth. The problem being how to define such a frame. It's highly debatable, but I would argue in a recent work that apparently just came out in JGR that I did with Jean Bess, that true polar wonder velocity has been rather slow and constant over the last 50 million years and had been much faster in previous times, going back to actually more than 100 million years ago. Our data set with decreasing quality goes back to 200 million years ago. So you see 4 different sets of data that all seem to indicate velocities. If you take the first derivatives of the top 3 curves, you find a step function like the lower one, meaning all of the second derivatives of all these time series have a delta function at about 50 million years ago. Something happened that separated 2 rather quiet, uniform modes of motion. Well, I'm going to draw on a number of other observations to try and suggest what might happen. The first one is again looking at tomography. This is a 2850 kilometer depth, a tomographic section from Jeroen Rietzema. And you would find the same thing if you use most other people's tomography. You find that the 7 potential primary hotspots are close to the 2 large superswells that are at equatorial locations on antipodal parts of the Earth. And for Reunion, Tristan, Iceland, and Afar, again you find that they are close but not centered. They actually form 2 girdles surrounding the large superswells. At this very time, I think Tony Dallen is telling that using his new tomography with Gus Nollet and the students in Princeton, he can actually resolve these super plumes into bunches of plumes. And at this meeting also, Jerry Schubert told us that he believed these super plumes were actually bunches of plumes, and we may return to this later. Another bit of information that was very influential in my forming a picture of what might happen in my head was experiments by my co-author Anne Davaille, who showed that when you try to reconstruct in the lab thermochemical convection, putting 2 layers of fluids that have different thermal diffusivities and chemical diffusivities, depending on the ratio of these 2 events, and for very minute changes in the parameters, you generate 2 n-member kinds of instabilities, big domes, and thin plumes. The picture on the left portrays the development of very large domes in the lower layer. If you scale the parameters of the lab to the Earth, you would find that these domes form and oscillate on a typical period of about 200 million years, which looks awfully like the Wilson cycle. At the apex of these, when they touch the transition zone between the 2 layers, you can trigger secondary plumes, which are better seen in the left side of the right-hand cartoon. In other experiments with very slight changes in the parameter values, and I haven't shown this here, you generate the more traditional plumes that go all the way from the deepest layer to the surface of the experiment. Putting all these things together, we have recently suggested that actually there might be 3 types of plumes and not 1, each type of plume coming from one of the 3 boundary layers, which is where you expect instabilities to come from in the mantle. I think that something like possibly 20 out of the 50 generally recognized hotspots are, I would say, Andersonian in time, meaning that they're probably very shallow and they're just using reactivated fractures, fracture zones, and the melt is coming from shallow. Above the 2 superswells, which are fairly well seen in tomography and which may appear as more complex structures, I believe that you could generate indeed these secondary plumes, and that Tahiti and the plumes which are centered in the superswells are shallow. They are small flux most of the time. They are not long-lived. They have lasted something like 10, 20 million years, and none of them starts with a big plume head. They never start with a flood basalt. And the third type, the 7, the big 7, primary ones, could actually come from D double prime, and I think for various reasons linked to the experiments you've seen, for fluid mechanics reasons, and also because a flood basalt is typically 4 million cubic kilometers. If you take 10% partial melting, you must melt something which is 40 million cubic kilometers. If you put that in a sphere, you will find that it's filling more than the entire upper mantle. I think it's difficult to imagine that an instability rising from the transition zone will be able to develop a head that fills in the entire container. It's much easier in the experiments to do that with something which has time to do it because it comes from much deeper. And the motions you've seen, the fact that everything's been basically stable for the last 50 million years and was moving at a rather faster but uniform rate in the previous 50, with a major change, something happening 50 million years ago, I would argue that the primary plumes are simply stuck because of the high viscosity of the lower mantle, and they're passive tracers of slight changes in the overall motion of the two shells that form quadrupolar convection. So the idea would be that the lower mantle has remained fairly undeformable. Again, this means orders of magnitude of a centimeter per year in the last 50 million years. But before that, the two shells were in rather faster uniform motion. The question, of course, is to know what could have caused that motion and when it could have started, since clearly it had started prior to the oldest Hawaiian volcano. And using true polar wonder information, we suggest that two ideas could be pursued. One would be a major change in the geometry of plate boundaries at 130 million years ago, completely altering the balance of forces and torques acting on the plate boundaries at that time. And we know at 50 million, generalized collision between Arabia, India, and Eurasia also suppressed a large number of subduction zones, altering the balance of forces enormously. Another idea which might be interesting to pursue would be to suggest that a huge episode of mantle avalanching 130 million years ago started actually that phase of motion of the lower mantle halves. It's the easiest way by which you can change true polar wonder, and I think therefore this is something that could be pursued. The second thing I want to do is again going from deep to shallow to look at the surface traces and at the onset of the surface traces of these primary plumes. And that's a time series I went through very briefly. It's the time series of the ages of flood basalts and oceanic plateaus. I'm saying these are delta functions. Of course, they are not. This is a mathematical convenience. How short are they? How intense are they? And do these time series correlate with something else? You know that my interest and the interest of my group in that started in a very serendipitous way back 16 years ago when we worked in the Deccan Traps of India, and I have recounted that story in the book which Lisa mentioned, and also at previous AGU talks. And what we found, which I assume many of you already know, is the huge amount of lava erupted over the Deccan was actually erupted in a rather short time. Since we first started working on this trap, a lot of studies have added more and more precise absolute dates using potassium, argon, rhenium, osmium, and other chronometers. And this is from a recent paper by a student of mine who reanalyzed using argon rocks from the base to the top of the main section of the traps near Bombay. And from reading these numbers, you see very clearly that there is no resolvable age difference between the bottom and the top. And you see that the absolute age is awfully close to the Cretaceous tertiary boundary. One additional thing that was discovered by my colleague Narendra Bandari in Ahmedabad, and we went back and worked with him in India. If you look at this very small map of India, looking at the northwesternmost corner of the Indian traps, in a rather difficult area, which was actually shaken afterwards by the Bhuj earthquake, also a subject of great work and discussion at AGU, we found that in a sedimentary layer sandwiched between the Deccan flows, we could find, however deformed, the traces of the iridium anomaly, which marks the impact of the Cretaceous tertiary boundary Alvarez bolide. So this is very important because it shows that the two events were coeval in a sense. If you look at things on a 1 million year timescale resolution, of course, one event was exceedingly short by our measure of human life. The other was long, hundreds of thousands of years. And also because of simple 19th century stratigraphy, we see that the impact occurred when volcanism had started, which settled the question which had aroused some interest as to whether impact could generate flood basalt volcanism. I believe it cannot, despite recent publications, but in any case, you don't need to invoke something for which you have data showing that you don't need it. Although some people like to do that. I'm going to take you through a very brief tour, and with Paul Rennie recently we have tried to review at length the problem. We have reviewed the geography, geometry, volumes, and placement rates and dates of all of the large igneous provinces that have become the focus of enormous amounts of work by many laboratories since our early work on the Deccan. I'm just going to focus on 3 or 4 out of 12 which have now been studied, going back in the past. 133, 134 million years ago, that's what the Earth looked like, and at that time the Piranha Etendeca traps erupted, and most of the volcanism, most people would agree, was erupted in 1 million years or less. This is a case when it's unclear whether the event correlates with a mass extinction. If you take the biggies which were coming out of the background noise, the answer is there is no mass extinction at that time. It's awfully close to the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary, but we now know that the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary is not a major biological event. Actually, the largest event occurs slightly afterwards, at the end of the Valanginian substage. And what is the end of the Valanginian? It's 134 million years in most timescales, even though there is some leeway in that. So I would argue that there's evidence for a correlation, not with a mass, but with a minor mass extinction. The case is far more clear for what happened 200 million years ago, the eruption of the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. We've heard at this meeting that the total surface, original surface covered by that flood basalt province might have reached 10 million square kilometers, and most of the recent work shows that volcanism was very short, again order of 1 million years, and again to the best possible resolution, coinciding with one of the largest mass extinctions, the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. Going back 50 million years to 250, this is the time of eruption of the Siberian traps. They coincide exactly with the largest mass extinction that occurred in the Phanerozoic. An interesting thing which was pointed out by people studying stable isotopes or sea level change or rates of extinction was that apparently the size, the amazing size of the mass extinction at the end of the Paleozoic era might in part be due to the fact that we were looking at 2 discrete events. Again, a problem of resolution in time. Until 10 years ago, it was unclear whether there was a long event or short events. It became clear that there were actually 2 short, sharp events, one coinciding precisely with the Siberian traps, the other occurring some 5, 8, you could argue about that, million years before, at the end of a stage called the Guadalupian. There was a huge extinction, and if we were bold enough to believe in our hypothesis, we had to say there must have been a trap at that age, and it should be dated. And we did publish that prediction, and I'm calling that a prediction. Of course, I've put quotes because a prediction for something that occurred 258 million years ago is not particularly a remarkable foresight, or not very useful. But we basically said we should find a trap. It was found in China. It's now located in southern China. The reason it was not found earlier, it's a trap that was caught in the India-Asia collision. It was shredded to pieces. It almost disappeared, but the remnants have been found, can be dated, and the dating came out a few months ago in a couple of publications. There still is some amount of uncertainty, but they're very close to that period of 258, maybe a little younger. So clearly, the end of the Paleozoic was a double whammy. There were 2 events, a few million years apart, at 2 very different latitudes. The eruption of the Meishan traps occurred in the tropical or equatorial latitudes, whereas you saw that the Siberian traps erupted at high northern latitudes. And this may be interesting in terms of how you're forcing the climate at times of these extinctions. I believe that paleontology has for a long time shown us that there was not one. It's a little bit like my 3 kinds of hotspots. There are 3 scales of mass extinction, and people have been fighting saying my scale is right. I think we have evidence from paleontologists' work that there are 3 embedded scales for extinction. A very slow one, typical of plate velocities, plate motions, probably related to changes in spreading at mid-ocean ridges, correlated with sea level change, invoked for decades to explain changes in the environment that could lead to some amount of extinction, a faster embedded scale at the 1 million year time scale that is linked to the flood basalts, and a super fast one for which we have only one example so far, the Chicxulub crater in Mexico, which is on the order of a second, essentially instantaneous by any geological time standard. Together with Paul Rennie, we have compiled the age determinations for all the large igneous provinces going back to the beginning of the Phanerozoic. We're actually working on one, which is, you've seen this in progress in Paul Rennie's and my and Pierre-Yves Gillot's geochronology labs. We are currently dating a new trap that has been found hidden under the Siberian traps in Siberia, which I believe correlates with the previous large mass extinctions. But even without having these data, the correlation which we had proposed some 15 years ago has become better and better with any new data that come. You see that the 4 red dots correspond to the 4 largest mass extinctions that have occurred at the Cretaceous Tertiary, Triassic, Jurassic, Permo-Triassic, and Guadalupian-Tatarian boundaries. The 4 most recent largest mass extinctions each have a clear association with a large trap. When you do not see the uncertainties, it means they are smaller than the size of the circle I'm showing. There are uncertainties on every one of these points. We are currently dating the traps in Siberia. Geological analysis and rubidium-strontium ages show that large error bar, completely unacceptable so far, but consistent with the idea of proposing that we are seeing the previous 5th largest mass extinction at the Franian-Famennian boundary. I don't have time to go into the black dots, but they're essentially corresponding to other events, minor or smaller mass extinctions, or worldwide ocean anoxia events, which correspond to underwater eruption of large igneous provinces, oceanic plateaus. Only one point fails to correlate in that curve, meaning it's clearly significantly offset from the diagonal line. That is the Columbia flood basalt, and it's probably no chance that it is a rather unusual trap in that it is an order of magnitude smaller than all the other ones. That volcanism can affect climate has been suggested since Benjamin Franklin and has become quite clear with sulfur-rich eruptions in the last 15 or 20 years. So we can only suggest, after having seen this graph, that there must be some form of a connection between massive flood basalt eruptions and mass extinctions, and the only agent, causal agent, has to be loading of the atmosphere and eventually the fluid envelopes, atmosphere and oceans, with chemicals that alter the biosphere enough to generate stress that leads to complex mass extinctions. This was a weakness of the volcanic scenario until a few years ago. There's been tremendous progress over the last few years, and I expect much more in the coming years as to the kind of mechanisms that could generate the forcing function. Essentially, the traps will lead to huge amounts of SO2 and CO2, and in this cartoon, which I took from Paul Wignall, a review that he did last year, you find that you can explain all sorts of couplings, cooling, brief warming, longer warming, and I think the most significant recent thing that came up, even though it had been suggested before, that has come forward in the last year, is the notion that carbon dioxide injection, which must massively accompany flood basalts, eventually is a tremendous sink of that CO2 is the fresh flood basalt that has just been emitted. It's been found through a geochemical analysis that a surface of fresh flood basalt will absorb 7 times more moles of CO2 than an average continental surface. Desser and others have recently published on this. If you're interested, I think it's a very significant paper that came out in EPSL last year, in which through careful chemical analysis of waters from rivers flowing over the Deccan traps, they have been able to give a thermodynamical model of the speed at which CO2 partial pressure builds, and the lava eats that CO2 through alteration and throws it as altered products in the global ocean. In that way, you can predict pH changes, temperature changes, a partial pressure of CO2, and also evolution of the global ocean strontium isotope ratio. And I haven't shown this here in order to go a little bit faster, but it predicts very nicely the observed global strontium ratio. So and you see that on all those curves, which have been calculated for various scenarios of basalt intrusion, the time constant is on the order of 2 million years. So basically, when you have a flood basalt coming out in something like a few 100,000 years, it injects enormous masses of CO2. But in only 2 million years, it will have got rid of it through alteration and removal of half of the volume of the trap, which means that in most cases, half of the volume of the traps was gone in less than a couple million years, which forces us to reevaluate the original volumes of all the traps that suffered such alteration. So, I'm now going to go through a set of slides that are sort of the messages I would like you to take home, at least the things I think I've been brought to with this kind of analysis. One, primary plumes, which are the best candidates for something coming from the core mantle boundary, were born as large igneous provinces. They form a random, non-periodical set of delta function. Delta is 1 million years compared to hundreds. The time constant of the forcing function, which is the way the lava flows force the atmosphere, can go from as short as 1 to 10 years to 1 million years. Total duration of a flood basalt province is on the order of a few 100,000 years. Unfortunately, we do not have the resolution that allows us in detail to know what the flux is. But we know from volcanism that it's usually very episodic. You get bursts of activity and then long times with quiescence. It's most likely that bunches of these flows were emitted in very short times. Analysis by volcanologists of some of the largest flood basalt flows, some reach 5,000 cubic kilometers in volume for a single flow, were probably placed in no more than a year. Meaning that the instantaneous flux could be as high, certainly many cubic kilometers per year on average for hundreds of thousands of years, and probably locally in excess of thousands of cubic kilometers per year. And this is a figure you should compare to the current hotspot flux of a half cubic kilometer per year, or even the total production of basaltic ocean crusts on the 70,000 kilometers of the mid-ocean ridge system, which is on the order of 25 cubic kilometers per year. Something I've put up here, which I believe is very important, but I don't have time to go on, is that I believe that large igneous provinces, once you've taken into account continental breakup, erosion, removal of material, I think they're amazingly unimodal. Contrary to earthquakes, impacts, tsunamis, many natural phenomena that, as we've heard in the non-linear geophysics sessions, scale on a log-log plot, this is not true. Most flood basalts have a very similar volume, and there are very few small ones. Actually, Colombia may be another one, so it's not at all the same kind of distribution. There are some reasons to understand why the mantle window would lead us to rather homogeneous flood basalt volumes. I think this is a relevant parameter for people interested in production of plumes by the mantle and screening of those plumes by the lithosphere. So there's no doubt that these are absolutely major geodynamic events. It's been noted for a long time that the timing and location of flood basalts coincides very often with major continental breakup and opening of new ocean basins. And I noted some time ago that the present-day geometry of the Atlantic Ocean, which is made of 3 basins, the North, Central, and Southern Atlantic, is simply the memory of the spots where 3 successive plumes hit the surface and broke the basins apart, 200 in the central part, 130 in the southern part, and 60 million years ago in Greenland. It is becoming increasingly clear that these can have potentially huge climatic impact through the amount of CO2 and SO2, and more recently it's been suggested that the warming due to the greenhouse effect of the CO2 can trigger actually release of the methane clathrates, which is stored in the ocean sediments, which would lead, in the cases when you can reach a temperature that allows for that methane to be released, to an even increased greenhouse effect. I personally have less and less doubt as time goes by that we will be able, in a much more quantitative fashion shortly, to show that these are indeed the principal agent of mass extinction. The instabilities I've discussed express couplings between the Earth's various envelopes going down from the biosphere back to the core. I have listed some of the examples I showed you. I would like to turn to something far more speculative and uncertain, which I and several others have suggested off and on over the last 2 decades without much convincing argument, which is to have a look at and we're going back to one of Alan Cox's interests, the evolution in time of reversal frequency. This is from a plot with, of course, some parts being highly speculative by my young colleague Yves Gallet and Volodya Pavlov, where you see present to the left and 500 million years ago to the right. You know about that quasi-cyclical evolution of reversal frequency with long times when no reversals occurred, and most likely a third one being evidenced more and more around 450, 500 million years ago. And I think it's very difficult to escape to notice that two of the largest outbursts of flood basalts, 2 in the first case, 3 in the second one, and 2 of the largest mass extinctions, which have led 19th century geologists to define the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic, occurred on the order of 10 million years after the supercrones had ended. I think it's difficult to escape the idea that through some form of control of the core by the D double prime layer, magnetic reversal frequency has known of these events. In conclusion, I believe that we are finding that brief events, times of major change between much longer, quote, normal, unquote, periods are of great importance. They're underlining the fact that our sciences are basically and fundamentally historical sciences in which it is essential to measure time and to measure time better and better, so that any advance in magnetostratigraphy, cyclostratigraphy, geochronology, and there are and have been major advances over the last 10 years, and I hope there will be in the coming decade, have allowed us to resolve these short events which could never be ascertained before. In closing, I will say that I'm very happy to note that the role of geomagnetism and paleomagnetism in all these very exciting problems of the geosciences has been quite large in the last 50 years, and I expect that our very small section of AGU will continue and provide a lot more in the years to come. Thank you.